Today I'd like to do a video about the pronoun Watakushi in Japanese. I was originally going to try to cover more pronouns, but I found when I tried to cover multiple etymologies, like in my negation video, I felt that there was just too much information to try and fit into one video. I'd rather do one language feature per video well, than try to cover too many poorly. For this video I'll be using audio from the show Hyoge Mono. I'll just be using short snippets of audio to avoid any copyright issues, despite the fact nothing on this channel is monetized. Thank YouTube for that one. Now, I'm not normally a huge fan of anime, but occasionally I will find one I like, such as Hyoge Mono. The story focuses on a vassal of Oda Nobunaga who is obsessed with cultural things, such as rare artifacts, tea ceremonies, and so forth. Because the show is set in the 16th century, it uses a lot of archaic grammar as well as terminology. So, with that said, let's begin. The scene opens with our protagonist, Furuta Sasuke, the vassal of Oda Nobunaga, being sent to negotiate peace. Our supposed antagonist in this scene is Matsunaga Hisahide. When Matsunaga is given the terms of peace, he says the following poetic line. I have covered washi as a pronoun before, but I will go deeper into its etymological history here. Before we can start to unpack washi, we have to go look at Watakushi, which you may have heard of. Watakushi nowadays is the hyper-polite form of watashi. Why do we need to unpack Watakushi though? Well, washi is a pronoun that is derived from Watakushi. We have a chicken and egg scenario here. Before we can understand washi, the egg, we need to understand Watakushi, the chicken. I struggled to find a definitive source on the origin of Watakushi. If we look at A History of the Japanese Language by Bjarke Frellesvig, we can see that pronouns in Old Japanese look quite different. Notice where it says personal first. That just means a first-person pronoun. In English, first-person pronouns are I, me, mine. I'll get sidetracked if I try to explain more about the terms first, second, and third pronouns, so we'll just move on for now. The first-person pronouns in Old Japanese were wa, a, ware, and are. Do you recognize some of those? Amazingly, ware and wa have survived even today. They survive in the pronouns of ware and waga. Waga specifically is a combination of wa and the particle ga. The particle ga used to work like the genitive no. The famous Battle of Sekigahara illustrates how ga used to work like no. Sekigahara is made up of the kanji on the screen. Seki means barrier, gate, but that symbol in the middle, it looks a bit strange, doesn't it? It's identical to the katakana for care, but it actually represents the particle ga here. Why is this the case? That would require its own lengthy analysis on the history of writing Japanese, so I'm going to stay away from that for now. Just know in this context, it is just the particle ga. Then, the final character is hara, just meaning field. Following modern Japanese rules, it should be seki no hara. So, sekigahara just means barriers field, or the field where there is a barrier. It doesn't sound quite as epic now, does it? Now that we know that ga used to work like modern no, we can understand waga a bit more. In Old Japanese, you could say the following. I won't pronounce it as I don't fully understand the phonetic system of Old Japanese, but you can see how ga is used like no, like in modern Japanese. That's why you can say wagauchi in modern Japanese to mean my house. Let's get off this tangent. Do you notice how there's no watakushi in the list of Old Japanese pronouns? Again, I struggled to find a definitive origin for watakushi. The word does, however, appear in the tale of Genji, which was written in the 11th century in the Heian period. Please see this line. Tenjobito domomo watakushi no wakare oshimu okari. I translated the modern version of the Japanese line in this photo. It means something like, many of the courtiers also regretted their personal farewells. But watakushi here doesn't quite mean the same thing as it does in modern Japanese today. Watakushi was the antonym to oyake. Antonym is just a fancy word to mean opposites. Think of accept and refuse. they mean the exact opposite thing. I've put oyake on the screen. Do you notice the kanji for oyake? It's the same public meaning kanji that's used in ko-en, meaning park. So yes, oyake referred to public affairs, whereas watakushi referred to private affairs. Therefore, watakushi referred to private, non-public affairs, as opposed to meaning I or me necessarily. It still survives today in certain forms. Watakushi suru means to misuse public property for your own personal gain. Since suru means to do, very literally in English it can mean to make something a private affair as opposed to a public one. Watakushi began to gain its more modern sense of I or me in the Kamakura and Muromachi periods from around 1185 until 1573. I would just like to point out that those dates aren't concrete. As I'm sure you already know, historical periods very much blend into one another. It's not like everyone wakes up one day and goes, wow, it's now the Muromachi period. Enough of this rambling now. Let's get back to Washi. We form quite the etymological line here. We start with Watakushi, which means private affairs in the Heian period. It later began to mean I/me in the Kamakura and Muromachi periods, and ultimately it is where the modern pronoun watashi comes from. But I will now inform you that washi is just a dialectical version of watakushi/watashi. The Japanese on the screen is from a dictionary entry. It tells us that washi comes from watashi. It just comes from a sound change. Watashi turns into washi, if that makes sense. Interestingly, as well, it informs us that washi was actually used by women in the Azuchi Momoyama period that started in the 16th century until the end of the Edo period in the 19th century. However, it then tells us that nowadays men use it with their social equals or inferiors, and in more modern forms of Japanese media like Howl's Moving Castle, it's almost always used to depict elderly people and particularly elderly men. Okay, let's turn now back to the start of the video. We'll go back to Matsunaga Hisahide and the line that he says. To wrap up my thoughts now, there's not a huge amount to say. His depiction in the show Kyoge Mono is of an elderly, battle-hardened man, so it makes sense that they would choose washi for him in his dialogue. I look forward to making more videos on Japanese pronouns as they work quite differently than in English. I hope that was an interesting little dive into the etymology of Watakushi and how that became Watashi and ultimately how that became Washi.